and welcome. You're watching Gravitas with me, Priyanka Sharma. Here's what's coming up tonight.
New information that contains that
Joe Biden has warned Saudi Arabia. The U.S. president says there will be consequences. He says he will reevaluate the ties between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia. So why the sudden hostility? Well, all this after a global cartel of oil-producing countries led by the Kingdom and Russia said that they would slash oil output. Where are U.S. Saudi ties headed? How is Saudi Arabia going to respond to Biden's strong remarks? This is our cover story tonight on Gravitas. Stay with us. We'll get you insights from both sides of this equation. Diplomacy is a rather tricky game. You never know what's coming next. One moment, leaders of two countries are hugging it out, and the very next, they are up in arms. Take Joe Biden, for example. The American president was spotted fist-bumping with the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. This was less than 3 months ago. And now, he's promising to punish the kingdom. In an interview to an American broadcaster, Biden said there are going to be some consequences for what they've done with Russia. They here stands for Saudi Arabia. So what did they do with Russia? Most of you already know the backstory by now, but I'll quickly run you through the events. It all began on the 5th of October. The Organization of the Petrol Exporting Countries, along with Russia, announced that it would cut its oil production by 2 million barrels per day. And like most of you already know this, the grouping is called the OPEC+, and it is led by Saudi Arabia. So Riyadh is obviously defending the decision. It says the call was purely economic. The kingdom's oil minister said, and I quote, OPEC+ members acted responsibly and took the appropriate decision. The United States, however, is not convinced. It believes that the oil cartel's decision was quote-unquote against the interest of American people. Now, what has a number of oil barrels got to do with Americans? Simply put, rising consumer prices. It's basic economics. A fall in oil production will amount to a rise in oil prices, and that is the last thing America needs right now. 1. There is an impending recession, and this is something we will elaborate on in a bit. But mostly, Biden is upset about rising oil prices ahead of elections, crucial elections. The U.S. midterm polls are due this November. And the U.S. president knows that unhappy voters can be unforgiving. So that settles the anti-U.S. bit. But why is Biden hinting at a collusion with Russia? You see, Western analysts like to highlight how the fall in oil production will lead to a rise in oil prices, which would invariably add to the revenue of oil-producing countries. Now, Russia is a major oil producer, and critics say that Russia is using oil money to fund the Ukraine war. And that is how the OPEC+ decision is being seen as anti-American and pro-Russian. Now, the immediate fallout was this. The White House said that it will be reviewing ties with Saudi Arabia. The spokesperson for the U.S. National Security Council said, and I quote again, "We're not announcing a formal policy review here with a special team or anything like that, but what we're talking about is the president's belief that the relationship needs to be reviewed." And you already heard what Biden had to say. He did not elaborate what exactly he had in mind, but instead said, and I'm quoting again, "I'm not going to get into what I'd consider and what I have in mind, but there will be consequences." That's what made headlines. So quite a mixed signal here. There will be rethinking and reviews, but there will not be a formal policy announcement. There will be consequences, but at the same time, we don't know what the Biden administration is considering at the moment. What are these consequences? Let me explain. You see, America's ties with Saudi Arabia have not been the best under Joe Biden. Remember, he even campaigned on the promise of making Saudi Arabia a pariah state. He said his administration will make Riyadh pay for the assassination of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. But when Biden was elected president, he flew down to Riyadh to offer an olive branch to the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, MBS. He even did a little fist bump, an image we've seen repeatedly. And now, 3 months on, he wants to do a complete U-turn. The relationship between the two countries can best be defined as one for security. Let me explain. Saudi sells oil to the US and America sells arms. And that brings me to my next question. Can the US stop selling weapons to the Saudis? Freeze arms sales completely? Well, some Democrats are already demanding that. But will Biden oblige? One must realize that this is not a Trump White House that we are talking about. There is already a gap in amity between the two parties. For one, there is no open praise for the kingdom or any flaunting of arms deals. Some analysts say that recent developments could lead to a point of no return. Now, to give us some deeper insight into what one can expect in the coming days, I just caught up with Ahmed Al-Ibrahim. He's an expert on Saudi-US relations. He joined me from Riyadh earlier this evening. I asked him about how can we expect Saudi Arabia to respond to Biden's remarks. And this is what he had to say.
In very short, we are used to this kind of language from the Obama era, and nothing happened. Obama was as much as he was against Saudi Arabia, he's the most American president that he actually visited Saudi Arabia. 2 of them is actually to apologize, and we are used to it. This is an assessment that Biden is. He took initiative and he said it for the local consumption. As you know, and your viewers know, that we are approaching the midterm election, and the OPEC Plus reduction came in such a vital time, not to politicize any American or anything to do with America. It is basically pure for the interest of the OPEC Plus, but it did not resonate well with the internal politics of the United States, especially the Democratic Party and the extreme left. And we are used to it. I'm sure when he go back and he sits with his national security advisor and his cabinet and the people who really matters and really know what kind of relationship Saudi Arabia has and the United States, they will definitely shy away from this kind of statement.
You heard him. He clearly says that Saudi Arabia is used to this narrative since the Obama era. Now, here's the next big question, something that should interest our American viewers more. What does this turn of events mean for Biden? For starters, it is a diplomatic failure. All that jetting in and out of Riyadh, the fist bump, all of it clearly amounted to nothing. It is a foreign policy failure for the Biden White House. In fact, one of its many foreign policy failures. And it comes too close to the hasty exit from Afghanistan, or even for that matter, the escalation of tensions with Russia. Point number 2. Rising oil prices could mean an electoral defeat for Joe Biden. It could amount to loss of Congress seats. So here's a question. Will a weaker Biden be a dangerous Biden? As he loses votes in the midterms, will Biden try to secure this re-election by waging a war? It's a loaded question. After all, no US president has lost a re-election during wartime. Let me cite some examples. James Madison was re-elected during the War of 1812. President Lincoln during the Civil War. Roosevelt during the Second World War. Richard Nixon during the Vietnam War. George W. Bush was re-elected during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. So if Biden loses the midterms, what will be his strategy to cling on to power? We asked this question to Lieutenant Colonel Daniel L. Davis. He is a defense expert, and I want you to listen to what he said.
There's so many things that could change between now and then. It's hard to say what he would do after if he loses. But I mean, the near-term issue is very clear that there's a lot of anger, especially in Congress, wanting to suspend all military cooperation, stop all military assistance, and basically completely change the nature of the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States, regardless of how the midterms come out. So I'm not sure that the midterms are quite as big of an issue, certainly not on the other side. Because they're an issue right now, because any kind of rise in oil prices means a rise in gas prices, and that is always bad for the incumbents.
There's anger in Congress, he says, and that should sum up what you should be expecting in the coming days. It's a story that we will continue to track. Now let's switch gears and talk about the global economy. The IMF's economic counselor made a rather bleak prediction on Tuesday. Listen in.
The worst is yet to come, and for many people, 2023 will feel like a recession.
The IMF has revised its growth projections for next year. It has lowered it from 2.9% to 2.7%. In the next few minutes, we'll take you through what this means for all of us. But first, I want you to take a look at the statistics on your screen now. These are the latest growth projections for some countries. So if the IMF projections come true, the global economy will grow by 2.7% next year. And this is after adjusting for inflation. Let me break it down further. What does the IMF forecast mean for us? The IMF said that the year 2023 will feel like a recession for many. This means that the body doesn't think there will be a global recession. However, the economic counselor says that there was a 1 in 4 chance that the world growth would be below 2%. Listen in.
There's about 25% probability that world growth would be at 2% or below, and that's already a very low number. So 2% or below, we've only had that 5 times since 1970. So, and all of those 5 times, we sort of know what they are. This is the oil price shock of 73, the disinflation of 1981, the 2008 financial crisis, etc.
You heard him, invoking events like the 1973 oil shock and the 2008 financial crisis is never a great sign. But why should we care about the IMF's forecast, especially if the IMF is not exactly predicting a recession? It says it will feel like a recession. Let's now take a look at some of the latest inflation projections. The IMF's growth projections are adjusted for inflation, which means that the figure of 1% growth in the US for 2023 comes after we subtract 3.5% for inflation. So does that mean that people will overcome high prices? That affects all of us. That everything will be fine? Well, not exactly. Everyone across the country isn't going to all of a sudden become proportionately wealthier. That's because economic growth is not distributed equally. Let me give you some examples. CEOs can be expected to get bigger hikes than other employees. Therefore, some people will definitely grow less than others. But you see, unlike growth, inflation does not discriminate. So a loaf of bread will get more expensive for everyone, irrespective of their growth in salaries. And that is why a high growth rate is important during times of high inflation. The higher the growth rate, the more people benefit despite income inequality. But the IMF says that growth rates are going to stay low. So where does that leave the average person? Well, perhaps this calculation is why the IMF said that the year 2023 will feel like a recession for many people. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is blamed for the bleak economic outlook. The warfare has led to a global grain shortage. Both countries were among the world's largest producers of wheat. Exports have resumed after the UN and Turkey brokered a deal, but tons of grain was lost. The shortage has now driven fruit prices around the world. Then there's oil. The US and Western sanctions against Russia have led to a sharp rise in fuel prices. Europe is struggling to wean itself away from cheap Russian gas. In an attempt to punish Russia, Europe is now staring at an especially cold winter ahead. And of course, the recent OPEC Plus decision to cut oil production will also affect the fuel prices. From a US perspective, the projections would come as a relief. US President Joe Biden had recently announced that there may be a slight recession. So if the IMF projections are correct, he may be able to avoid that. Let's talk about the United Kingdom now. The UK's cost of living crisis shows no signs of abating. It is expected to see minuscule growth and high inflation. Meanwhile, China is expected to see its lowest growth rate in decades in 2022. The next year isn't expected to be too better for Beijing either. However, its inflation numbers are in control. President Xi Jinping can take some solace in that. Over the next 2 years, only some economies are expected to come out relatively unscathed. India is predicted to grow more than twice as fast as the rest of the world. This is despite India's growth projections getting reduced. So what does this mean? Well, that India is an emerging economy. India has been outpacing other nations for years, and it will continue to do so. It did start from a lower base and continues to catch up to the high-income nations. And for a more ground-level perspective, India is still expecting shopping sprees during the upcoming festive season. So can the so-called developed world say the same? Think about that while we shift our focus now to Ukraine. We're now 230 days into the war and things remain the same. The Russian offensive continues, as does the Ukrainian resistance. The past few hours have been critical, courtesy Russia's relentless bombings. For more than 3 days now, Moscow has been raining missiles on Ukraine, most of them on busy streets and city centers. Take a look at these images now. They're from Zaporizhia. Russia dropped 12 missiles here on Tuesday. They destroyed several residential buildings. Visuals from the site show emergency workers rescuing a family trapped in rubble. Similar images have emerged from the capital, Kyiv. On Monday, it fell victim to a sustained bombing spree. The attacks have left behind a trail of destruction. Visuals show that the residents of Kyiv are sweeping up glass shards, hauling rubble, and fixing plywood sheets over the windows of their homes, many of which have been left without power or water, basic essentials. The victims say they have no words to describe the horror they have witnessed. Listen into a few voices now.
There are no respectable words to describe the horror we lived through after the attack of the Russian invaders. I cannot even refer to them as people. They are worse than zombies, creatures that want to destroy the Ukrainian nation.
It's the apocalypse. There are no other words for it. It is terror and war against innocent civilians who have not expected this. To be honest, at that time I heard an explosion, saw the fire, was very scared. And to this day, I still feel traumatized and scared when I take the car out and get caught in a traffic jam.
Now, this was the latest as far as the war is concerned. And now let's talk about the efforts to end it. The ongoing diplomatic meetings and talks. On Tuesday, the leaders of the G7 held a meeting, vowing to bolster Ukraine's defenses. In a joint statement, the group said, and I quote, "We will continue to provide financial, humanitarian, military, diplomatic and legal support and will stand firmly with Ukraine for as long as it takes." This was on Tuesday. Today, there was another important meeting, a meeting of NATO's defense ministers. They assembled in Brussels earlier today to step up and sustain support for Ukraine. Also to strengthen their own defenses. And this was the first big NATO meeting after Russia annexed more territory. So what went down at this meeting? A couple of major decisions were taken. To start with, NATO allies decided to provide air defense systems to Ukraine so that it could combat the ongoing Russian missile attacks. In fact, a day before this meeting, Ukraine had already received the first of 4 IRIS-T SLM air defense systems, which were manufactured by Germany. Other countries are expected to follow suit.
I welcome that NATO allies are providing air defense systems. That is extremely important. And I welcome the recent announcement by Germany and also the delivery of German air defense systems to Ukraine.
Meanwhile, America too is following Germany's lead. Reports suggest that it plans to give Ukraine an air defense system, which is used to protect the White House. It's called NASAMS, or the National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile System. America has reportedly approved sending 8 of them, with the first 2 to be delivered in the next few weeks. Meanwhile, Canada, another NATO member, plans to send 40 combat engineers to Poland. What for? To train Ukrainian soldiers. Remember, the Canadian Armed Forces have already trained more than 33,000 Ukrainian military personnel since 2015. But some aspects of this training were paused in February. Canada now plans to resume them. Listen in now to this statement by the Canadian Defence Minister.
Today, I am announcing that in the coming weeks, Canada will deploy approximately 40 combat engineers to Poland to help Polish forces train Ukrainian sappers on engineer reconnaissance, explosives, mining and demining.
Interestingly, Australia too is considering training Ukrainian troops. Its Prime Minister recently dialed the Ukrainian president and offered his resolute support against Russia. Reports say the training, however, would not take place in Ukraine. The process will take place outside of Europe. The place and date are yet to be finalized. So 8 months into this war, this is where things stand. Russia is still raining missiles on Ukraine. Ukraine's allies are still bolstering its defenses. But it's evident that efforts to end the war or even find a truce are going nowhere, sadly. It is the 12th of October. Exactly 20 years ago on this day, a terror attack unfolded in Bali. It claimed the lives of at least 202 people. Most of them were foreign nationals. Today marks the 20th anniversary of this gruesome event, one that forced Indonesia to confront extremists breeding on its soil. So how have things changed 20 years on? Here's a report.
This is Bali, one of Indonesia's 37 provinces, renowned for its rich heritage. 20 years back, it came under attack, the most gruesome attack in its history. It involved the detonation of 3 bombs. The first 2 were detonated in the tourist district of Kuta. A third, much smaller device exploded outside the U.S. consulate in Denpasar. The casualties were colossal. More than 202 people died in these bombings. Most of them were foreign nationals. There were 88 Australians, 38 Indonesians, 23 Britons, and people from more than 20 other nationalities. So, who was behind the attack? The Jemaah Islamiyah, an Indonesia-based Islamist group, which wants an Islamic state in Southeast Asia. Was this the real motive behind the attack? No one knows. But a year since the attack was carried out, an audio tape was leaked. It was attributed to Osama bin Laden, who claimed the bombings were in retaliation to America's war on terror. However, the authorities denied his involvement in the attacks. Today is the 20th anniversary of this heinous crime, a crime that still remains etched in people's memories.
We will now hold a minute's silence to reflect on and remember the lives lost and those injured in the Bali bombings.
These commemorations and services are proof. These are families of the victims of survivors, paying tribute to the people they lost, holding a minute of silence in respect.
20 years later, the pain is still felt. That night remains seared into the national memories of Indonesians, Australians, and so many others.
I'd been in the AFP for over 20 years, but I'd never experienced a tragedy on this scale. But amongst the sadness at the hospital, I also began to see the positives of humanity.
In Sydney, a similar ceremony was held. It was attended by Australia's Prime Minister himself, with thousands of Australian citizens in attendance. A few miles away, The Australian Parliament also commemorated the attack, calling it the worst of humanity, which brought out the very best.
But ultimately, the terrorists failed. Because while an act of terror might shake us, it cannot change us. Those who attacked us wanted to divide Australia and Indonesia, to shatter the bonds between two great democracies, painstakingly built on multi-faith, multicultural foundations, and to strike at what makes us all human. But the worst of humanity brought out the very best. Out of that dark act were born such radiant acts of courage and of love.
Back in Bali, the survivors of the event recalled the night that changed their lives, the visceral impact of the attack and the trauma they endured.
To be honest, at that time I heard an explosion, saw the fire, was very scared. And to this day, I still feel traumatized and scared when I take the car out and get caught in a traffic jam.
The Bali bombings were indeed a watershed moment for Indonesia, a country with the world's largest Muslim population. It forced the secular state to confront the presence of extremists. Immediately after the attack, Indonesia set up an elite anti-terrorism unit called Special Detachment or Densus 88. It weakened the group behind the attack and resulted in scores of extremists being held. The country also pioneered de-radicalization schemes, but to this day these schemes face tough questions on their effectiveness. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
Our next story is about influence. At the center of this story is one Adnan Syed. He is an American man who recently walked out of a prison in Baltimore. Adnan was serving 23 years in jail, and that too for a crime he never committed. The story begins in 1999. Adnan was accused of murdering his ex-girlfriend. Her name was Hae Min Lee. Adnan and Lee were high school classmates. In 1999, Lee was found dead. Her body was found buried in the woods. A year later, a jury found Adnan guilty of premeditated murder. He was labelled a scorned lover and he was jailed for life. Adnan was all of 18 and now he is 41. Adnan spent the last 2 decades in jail, all the while maintaining innocence and appealing the court's decision. Not once, but twice. In fact, multiple times. Adnan's application was never accepted, but something changed in 2014. A family friend of the Syeds shared Adnan's story with a journalist, pleading with the journalist to reinvestigate the case, look into it. And now, this journalist started a podcast, a famous podcast, in autumn that year. The podcast was called Serial. It tried to piece together a timeline of the events leading to Lee's disappearance and death. It also revealed fresh details and potential suspects. The podcast became a huge hit. The first season alone was downloaded more than 300 million times. It also inspired a 4-part documentary. Then in 2015, Syed was granted a fresh trial. And this was partly based on the evidence that was uncovered during the making of the podcast. For example, a touch DNA testing was done on Lee's clothes. Multiple DNA samples were found on her shoes, but none of the DNA matched Adnan's. His conviction was quashed on the 20th of September. So, was Adnan's conviction wrongful? Yes, says the Baltimore State Attorney's Office. Adnan has now been cleared of murder. Had it not been for the podcast, he would likely still be behind bars. You see, that's the power of good content. It can move, it can influence, and perhaps in this case, even deliver justice. A part of the podcast focused on how the jury could have been biased because Adnan was a Muslim. It pointed out that the other 2 suspects who are now in focus have crime records. Both have been booked for violence against women. One has even been convicted. One of the suspects never made it to trial despite failing a lie detector test. In 2019, a man named Curtis Flowers walked out of prison. He had been behind bars for 23 years. Curtis was a black man. He was tried 6 times for the same crime by the same white prosecutor. A podcast brought Curtis's case to light. His conviction was finally quashed by the U.S. Supreme Court. There are numerous such cases around the world, and each one makes us believe in the impact, in the influence of powerful content. It gives us hope that in times where the word influence has become synonymous with paid posts and Instagram influencers, there is still content that can bring about a change for good. Speaking of change, our next story is from Germany. It is now debating implementing speed limits on the Autobahn, the country's federal highway system where you can drive at great speed. It's famous for that, without being booked for a traffic violation. Activists in Germany are upset at this. They're protesting the lack of speed limits by blocking roads and highways in the country. Here's a report with all the details.
Welcome to Germany, the world's premium car production hub, famous for its outstanding automotive industry. A fact German authorities are so proud of that they don't really believe in enforcing speed limits. On some German highways, you can drive at 120 to 130 kilometers per hour and not get booked for a traffic violation. And on some freeways, you can get away with 400 kilometers per hour. No kidding here, almost 70% of the Autobahn, which is Germany's federal highway system, doesn't have what the Germans call a tempo limit. This results in 75% more deaths and injuries on sections without the speed limit. Reports further say that 4,000 people are seriously injured each year due to this policy. German activists have had enough of this. They're gluing themselves on roads and highways to make authorities reconsider the speed limit. They first did this in June. At least 9 members of Last Generation, a radical environmentalist group, blocked the Autobahn, causing a major traffic jam. And on the 11th October, the same group blocked traffic in Berlin. Their demand was the same, enforcing a speed limit on the Autobahn. What are the authorities doing about this? Not much. These protests are being met with arrests and detentions. But the movement refuses to die down, thanks to the support of renowned Germans like Sebastian Vettel, a 4-time F1 champion, who currently drives for Aston Martin. A few months back, he spoke in favor of a speed limit. Now, here's the thing. Rash driving on the Autobahn is not just lethal, but it's also bad for the climate. In 2018, Germany emitted 860 million tons of CO2. Out of this, 158 million tons were ascribed to road traffic and the lack of speed limits. This is no small number. It only makes the case for enforcing speed limits in Germany more compelling. WION World is One.
Now let's talk about COVID. On the show, we've spoken about the children of the pandemic, those who grew up in lockdown without much social interaction, glued to screens to learn and interact. What about those born in lockdown? New research says that lockdown babies may miss important milestones. When the pandemic first hit most of the world in 2020, governments rushed to implement lockdowns. Some lockdowns were especially strict. Families were trapped in their houses for months. Social distancing was the norm. It was almost impossible to meet anyone except close family members. And this was true for both adults and children. And of course, for babies too. So how did the lockdown affect toddlers? Did it matter that these kids didn't meet any strangers? And what about not being able to see the outside world, go to parks, daycare? Did all these factors affect their growth? Well, a study by Irish doctors seems to suggest that it did. A team at the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland studied 309 lockdown babies. These were children born between March and May in 2020. So did these lockdown babies reach growth milestones as quickly as other children? The doctor said that there was a noticeable variation. According to the study, lockdown babies took longer to speak, they were less likely to point at things, and they were less likely to wave goodbye. However, lockdown babies often learn to crawl in less time than others. That's what the study says. The doctors had a theory for all these differences, that lockdown babies took longer to speak because there were less people to talk to. In times before the pandemic, these children would have been meeting new people all the time. They would have heard new words when they were taken outside. But being stuck at home may have slowed the learning process. And that's what the study finds. This study gives us some insight into some of the long-term effects of the pandemic. For instance, babies usually point at things that they want, maybe something new and shiny. Lockdown babies would have gone through these things rather quickly at home. And as for waving goodbye to people, who would they have to wave to? Everyone they knew or were familiar with was stuck at home with them. Doctors also proposed a reason for the early crawling. Lockdown babies were not being carried around to new places. They were not being strapped to car seats. They spend more time on the ground at home rather than with other children. Therefore, they started crawling faster. All these points may sound logical, but this by no means is a definitive study, and I want to stress on that. Let me state this clearly. Comparison among babies is not a new story. And if you speak to elders in your family, they would tell you that each baby is different. Each one's trajectory is unique. Children grow and learn things at their own pace. There is no universal standard or benchmark for when a child needs to start talking or walking. But maybe you're still worried. You may think that things apply to your lockdown baby as well. Well, I'll say there's no need to fret. The doctors stressed that all babies can catch up. Luckily, at the age, the lockdown experiences are not long-lasting. Let's move on now. When we talk about lockdowns and children, we often talk about increased screen time, delayed milestones, lack of socialization. But what happens when your child chooses to stay cooped up in a room? A remote or gaming controller in hand, eyes glued to a video game. It would be fair to say that gaming addiction is flying under the radar, and its impact on your child's health and well-being is slowly coming to light. Take this new study, for instance. It finds that video games may trigger lethal heart problems among some children. Just think of those terms being used in the same sentence: heart problems and children. The research was published in the journal Heart Rhythm. It clearly states, and I quote, "Electronic gaming can precipitate lethal cardiac arrhythmias in susceptible children." Let me explain. A cardiac arrhythmia is an irregular heartbeat. This study finds that playing video games poses a serious risk to children with arrhythmic conditions, underlying conditions. Basically, kids who may have underlying issues which can lead to irregular heartbeat. And in those cases where these ailments often go unnoticed or undiagnosed, video games can in that case prove to be lethal. Imagine this. The child is playing a video game 1 second and suddenly loses consciousness the next. A scary scenario, but it has happened. There have been cases reported of children and adolescents experiencing irregular heartbeat during gaming. And this new research documents this rather strange but distinct pattern among kids. 22 cases were studied, and it was found that multiplayer war gaming was the most frequent trigger for kids losing consciousness. But why is this happening? Well, the study attributes this to the electronic gaming environment. Think about it. It is emotionally charged. If you're a gamer, you'd know this feeling. You lose lives, gain lives, you run out of lives. These are not my words. That's the gaming lingo. You're in an excitable state. And if you have an underlying heart condition, this can prove fatal. That's what this study is saying. Now, we don't want to generalize. The study says that this phenomenon is not common. But now it is becoming more prevalent. So there is a clear concern here. Gaming addiction, it's a story we've looked into multiple times on this show. As video games surge in popularity, their impact, especially on children, needs a review. Look at these figures now. The gaming industry could be worth $321 billion by 2026. The pandemic added to the gaming boom as millions of new players remained glued to their gaming consoles during lockdowns. China and the United States accounted for half of global gaming in 2021. And kids were easy targets for the gaming industry during lockdown. How else were they to spend their time? One report found that children in the US spent much more time playing video games than engaging on social media. In fact, last year, China prohibited minors from playing video games on school days. China likened gaming addiction to spiritual opium. While that may be a bit extreme, let's be frank, it is often hard as a parent to identify when a hobby turns into a habit and when it becomes an addiction for your child. Habit-forming games lure in players back every day. They lull them into thinking there is no other option but to play. And that's exactly what gaming developers want. It's not just about joy and entertainment, but about catching them young. So before you give in to your child's demands and buy the next popular gaming console, think about the risks that come with it. And now let's take a look at what's making news around the world. Time now for Gravitas Global Headlines.
Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid says his government has approved, by a large majority, the principles of agreement with Lebanon, which ends decades of hostility over a maritime border dispute. Russian President Vladimir Putin says his country is a reliable energy supplier and blames the West for disruptions on the market at an energy forum in Moscow. Poland cites a leak in one of the Druzhba pipelines on the main route for oil to Germany, adding concerns about energy security as EU nations work on a proposal to address the fuel crisis. After accusing U.S. and Israel for inciting protests across Iran, country's supreme leader Khamenei calls protesters enemies as demonstrations over Mahsa Amini's death escalate. Indian authorities halt production at a pharmaceutical factory under investigation over the deaths of 66 children in Gambia. The Myanmar court convicts ousted leader Aung San Suu Kyi on 2 more corruption charges, increasing her sentence to a total of 26 years. 477 pilot whales die in mass strandings on New Zealand's remote Chatham Islands, says the government after ruling out a rescue effort in the area's shark-filled waters. Meta founder and CEO Mark Zuckerberg lost over 119 million Facebook followers temporarily, bringing his follower count to 10,000 due to a software bug. England have completed a T20 International Series win over world champions Australia. David Malan hit 82 as the visitors posted 178 for 7 in Canberra. All-rounder Sam Curran started with the ball, taking 3 for 25. Kylian Mbappe was on the scoresheet as PSG drew 1-1 with Benfica in the Champions League. The 23-year-old reportedly wants to leave the club just 3 months after signing a 3-year deal. The club management has denied the reports.
And that's a wrap on the show. Thanks for watching Gravitas with me, Priyanka Sharma. We'll see you tomorrow, leaving you as always with Gravitas Images.
C'est toi qui as appelé?
T'as rien eu sur les statuts?
Non, rien.
Monsieur, bonjour. Vous êtes sur une zone privée, vous enlevez tout ça, s'il vous plaît.
Hello, Huey. C'est la vraie. This building was designed with advanced algorithms abroad. A journey from 2071 to the present